My life was sidelined for my brother's fake illnesses. They missed my graduation, my birthday, everything. But when I found their texts planning to sabotage my wedding, I finally walked away. They missed my graduation, my birthday, even the day I got promoted. Every milestone I earned was tossed aside like it never mattered. All because my little brother might have needed a Tylenol or some air from his inhaler. But when I found out he faked it all just to steal the spotlight, everything I'd been holding back finally exploded. I used to believe my family was like most others, middle-class, suburban, 4-bedroom house, backyard grill-outs in the summer, vacations that never took us farther than Indiana. But I swear, everything flipped like a switch the moment my little brother Neil got diagnosed with asthma at age 7. I was 11 then, old enough to understand that asthma wasn't cancer, it wasn't a death sentence, and it definitely didn't require your parents to forget they had another child entirely. But try telling that to mine. From that moment on, Neil became the epicenter of every moment, every plan, every ounce of attention and energy in our home. He'd cough once during dinner and suddenly the meal was over. Mom was rushing for his inhaler. Dad was calling the doctor. And I'd just be sitting there with my fork midair, wondering what I did to become invisible. I tried not to take it personally at first, thought maybe they were just scared and overreacting. But then they kept doing it. Over and over. My life became a string of missed moments. I was 12 when I played a solo piano piece at the winter concert, one my teacher said was usually saved for the older students. I practiced every day for months, fingers stiff and sore, heart pounding with the hope that maybe this time they'd see me. They promised they'd sit in the front row. I still remember scanning the crowd before I went on stage, staring at every adult face, praying to spot theirs. But they never showed. Said Neil had an asthma flare-up. Later that night, my grandma casually mentioned Neil was on the couch playing video games when she called. I didn't even cry. I just swallowed it down and pretended it didn't matter. By 16, it was harder to pretend. I had grandparents flying in from Florida for my birthday, the kind who always sent checks and cards but didn't visit often. I was excited not for presents but because it felt like maybe this year, the day would actually be about me. My parents were supposed to pick up the cake, the balloons, the decorations. Instead, they vanished for hours because Neil had to go to urgent care. Turns out he had seasonal allergies. You know what I got? Grocery store cake and cold pizza. And later, I found out Neil ate most of my custom cake in the hospital waiting room. 2 slices were saved for them. That was the moment I started building a wall. Not out of hate, but out of necessity. You can only take so many rain checks on your own life before you stop inviting people to the table. When graduation came, I stood up in front of 400 classmates and gave a valedictorian speech that no one in my family heard. They said Neil was having a panic attack about finals. His finals, mind you, were still a week away. I smiled through the speech, shook hands, posed for pictures with my best friend's parents who'd saved a seat at dinner for me. On the inside, I felt like a ghost, like I could vanish right there on that stage and no one at home would notice I was gone. College was a war zone of late nights, minimum wage jobs, and caffeine-fueled study marathons. I didn't get help, not because my parents couldn't afford it. They had a fat college fund ready to go. But it was all earmarked for Neil. You know, just in case. Just in case what, I wondered? He hadn't needed his inhaler in over a year. But they still acted like he was fragile glass. And me? I was stone. Not because I wanted to be, but because no one else was going to hold me up. It wasn't until years later, after I'd met Jamie, my now wife, that I got my first taste of what family could be like. His parents remembered my birthday. His sisters brought me snacks during finals. His dad taught me how to grill ribs and called me kiddo, like I'd always belonged. When he proposed, I said yes with a full heart. But in the back of my mind, I already knew. There was no way I was inviting my parents or my brother to the wedding. And when you hear why, you'll understand. When Jamie and I started planning the wedding, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd be able to push all the history down far enough to make space for them at the table. I pictured it. My dad shaking Jamie's hand with pride. My mom wiping a tear from her cheek as I walked down the aisle. Even Neil cracking a real smile instead of his usual smug grin. But the deeper we got into the planning, the clearer it became. I wasn't imagining a family reunion, I was writing fiction. None of that had ever existed, and deep down, I knew it never would. Jamie's family, on the other hand, they jumped into the wedding planning like it was a national holiday. His mom offered to help with flowers. His sisters immediately volunteered as bridesmaids. His dad took me aside one afternoon and said, "Whatever you need, I'm there." And he meant it. No hesitation, no conditions, just support, the kind I didn't know how to receive at first because I'd never been offered it before. But the thing that sealed it for me, the moment I knew there was no going back, was a vision I couldn't shake. I imagined standing at the altar in the middle of our vows and hearing a phone go off in the pews. My mom rushing outside. My dad following close behind. And Jamie standing beside me, confused as to why half the bride's side was suddenly empty. Neil probably had a stomach cramp or a migraine, something that required urgent attention and, more importantly, an excuse to steal the spotlight. Again. So we made the call. No invitation for Neil. No invitation for my parents. It wasn't out of spite, it was survival. I wanted one day, just one, where my life didn't have to take a backseat to whatever medical drama Neil could manufacture. Jamie understood. He said, "Whatever you decide, I'm behind you." And he meant it. We kept the wedding small, 80 guests, mostly Jamie's side and a handful of close friends. I invited my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, but I pulled them aside quietly, told them not to mention a word to my parents. Most of them nodded without a second thought. They'd seen enough over the years to understand. The morning of the wedding was the first time I'd ever felt peaceful. Not anxious, not forgotten, just steady. Jamie's mom helped me get ready. His sisters did my hair. His dad polished my shoes like I was his own kid. I didn't even realize how much I'd needed that kind of warmth until I was drowning in it. During the ceremony, I looked out into the crowd, and instead of seeing empty chairs reserved for people who never showed up, I saw faces beaming with pride. I saw my grandfather wiping away tears. I saw Jamie's little cousin grinning with excitement. I saw people who wanted to be there for me not because they had to, but because they chose to. The reception was better than I could have imagined. Jamie's dad gave a speech about family and love and how he'd never seen his son happier. My grandparents danced with me, told me how proud they were. His sisters pulled me into a group hug that smelled like vanilla and hairspray and new beginnings. And for the first time in my life, I believed the day belonged to me. Then the photos hit social media. It started with a harmless post. My cousin Kay snapped a picture of me and Jamie laughing during our first dance. Captioned it, "Most beautiful wedding I've ever attended." Within hours, my phone exploded. Texts, voicemails, missed calls. All from my parents. My mom's voice, sharp and trembling, said I was ungrateful. My father accused me of humiliating the family. Said I was punishing them for being good parents to a sick child. And Neil? He posted a cryptic Instagram story about betrayal and some people forgetting who's always been there for them. It was laughable, honestly, because they had never really been there. Not when it mattered. Not when it counted. That night, I sat in our honeymoon suite, staring at the messages piling up on my phone, wondering for a moment if I'd made a mistake. If maybe I should have let them come. But Jamie sat beside me, wrapped his arm around my shoulder, and said, "You didn't ruin anything. You finally protected something that was yours." And I believed him. But what I didn't know then, what would come crashing into my world like a wrecking ball just a few weeks later, was that Neil had a secret. One he'd been hiding for years. And once it came out, everything I thought I knew about my family would unravel, piece by piece. I was out with Jamie's mom, grabbing coffee on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks after the wedding when she mentioned something that stopped me cold. Something about how Neil's behavior over the years didn't match up with the kind of respiratory issues my parents claimed he had. She's a pediatric nurse, works with kids who have serious conditions every day, and she said plain as day, from what I've seen on his social media, he's not sick. At least not the way they've told you. At first, I brushed it off, told myself maybe he'd just gotten better. But that thought sat in the back of my mind like a splinter. And when Kay, my cousin, called me a few days later asking to meet up, I had this knot in my gut that told me something big was coming and I wasn't ready for it. We met at this little diner halfway between our places, the kind with chipped mugs and laminated menus, and before we even ordered, Kay leaned across the table and said, "I need to tell you something about Neil." Her hands were shaking. She looked guilty, like she'd been holding it in for years and couldn't carry it anymore. She told me that when they were teenagers, Neil admitted to her flat out that he faked or exaggerated his symptoms all the time. Said it started out as a way to get out of chores or skip school, but it turned into something more. A game. A strategy. His exact words, according to Kay, were, "They believe anything I say if I make it sound like I can't breathe." I stared at her like she'd just told me the sky was green. My mouth went dry. Because it all made sense now. Every birthday ruined. Every ceremony missed. Every last-minute emergency that pulled my parents away from the only moments that ever meant anything to me, none of it was real. Or worse, it was real only because he made it so. Kay pulled out her phone, showed me messages from my mom, ones I wish I could unread. In them, my mother was talking about creating a distraction at my wedding. She hadn't even known yet that she wasn't invited. She wrote that she was concerned Neil would need support on a day when I would be getting too much attention. She suggested that maybe he could have a flare-up during the ceremony to remind people what really matters. I swear I felt my heart skip a beat. The betrayal wasn't just from Neil. It was my own mother plotting to sabotage my wedding before she even knew she wasn't welcome. It wasn't about missing me, it was about missing control. About keeping the spotlight where they thought it belonged. I didn't cry right then. I just sat there, numb. Kay kept talking, sharing story after story I had half remembered or tried to forget. Like the time Neil sprained his ankle during a family picnic the same day I was set to perform a solo at a community choir event. Or the summer I gave up a spot in a prestigious science program because Neil had a sudden health scare and my parents said I couldn't leave them to manage it alone. I went home that night and sat on the edge of the bed, still in my jacket, staring at the floor while Jamie read the messages Kay had sent me. I watched his face shift from confusion to anger to something quieter, heartbreak, maybe. They stole everything from you, he said. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe it. I tried to reach out to Neil after that. Not to scream or accuse, but because I wanted to hear it from him. I sent 3 messages. Nothing. Then Kay called me again, this time to say that when she confronted Neil about the texts, he blew up, accused her of turning on the family, said she was choosing sides. But here's the kicker, he didn't deny anything. Jamie told me I didn't need Neil to admit it. I had the truth already. But something in me still craved the confession. Maybe because I wanted to believe that somewhere, buried under all that manipulation, was a brother who regretted what he'd done. A brother who could change. But if that person existed, he wasn't ready to face me. And my parents? They didn't just double down, they went full on damage control. My dad left a voicemail telling me I was killing Neil with stress and that my selfishness was to blame for his latest hospital visit. That's when Kay called again because, apparently, while Neil was supposedly in the ER, she saw him at a baseball game, laughing and drinking beer with his buddies. It wasn't just emotional anymore. It was a pattern of lies so deeply woven into the fabric of my family that no one even questioned it anymore. And I was the crazy one for finally pulling the thread. But what happened next? That tore the last piece of illusion away. Because it wasn't just about what they'd done in the past. It was about what they still planned to do even now after everything. After everything Kay had shown me, after reading those messages where my own mother talked about staging a health crisis at my wedding, I thought that was it. I thought I had finally hit the bottom of whatever emotional well my family had buried me in for years. But as it turns out, they were still digging. And this time, they were using shovels made of guilt and manipulation, sharpened by years of practiced denial. It started small. A few relatives who hadn't reached out in years suddenly popped up in my messages, saying things like, "You know your mom only did what she thought was best," or "Neil's struggling now more than ever, don't you think it's time to move past this?" They all talked like I had thrown a grenade into a happy household instead of exposing a house of cards built on decades of lies. My dad left another voicemail a few days later. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, and he said, "You tore this family apart to prove a point, and you'll regret it when Neil's condition worsens from all this stress." As if I was the one who had trained my brother to weaponize his health. As if I was the one who plotted to hijack my own wedding just to shift attention away from the bride. The messages came in waves, some angry, some pitiful, all rooted in the same demand: fix it. Fix what I'd done. Fix their image. Fix the illusion. But the moment I realized just how far my parents were willing to go came one afternoon when Jamie's mom, God bless her, she's got the patience of a saint, decided to step in. She's been a pediatric nurse for over 3 decades and she's seen every kind of illness, real and imagined. She thought maybe, just maybe, she could talk to my mom woman to woman, find some middle ground. So she called. And not 5 minutes into the conversation, my mom hung up on her. Jamie's sister got a call next, my mom complaining that his family was meddling in private affairs. As if questioning the legitimacy of a man who plays basketball on the weekends but claims to need urgent care every time his sister gets promoted was some sort of federal offense. That was when it hit me, my parents didn't want peace. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted control. The same control they'd used to turn every milestone of mine into a footnote under Neil's name. The same control they'd used to convince the extended family that I was selfish and cold for setting boundaries they never respected. The same control they clung to when they justified kicking me off the priority list for everything from birthday cakes to college funds. And you know what hurt the most? I could take the lies. I could take the guilt trips. But what I couldn't stomach anymore was the rewriting of history like none of it had ever happened. I remembered something that night. A memory I had buried so deep I almost didn't trust it when it came back. I was 17. I'd saved up for months working part-time at a coffee shop to buy a dress for homecoming. Not just any dress, the dress. I'd been nominated for homecoming court, and for once I felt like I might actually be seen. The night of the dance, I was halfway through curling my hair when Neil came out of the bathroom clutching his stomach, saying he felt like he was dying. My parents didn't hesitate. They grabbed their keys, said they were taking him to the ER, and told me to sit tight just in case we get back in time. They didn't. I sat on the couch in that dress for 3 hours before my date finally gave up and went to the dance without me. I missed the court announcement, missed the pictures, missed everything. And when they finally walked through the door, guess what the diagnosis was? Gas. Not appendicitis. Not an ulcer. Just plain old indigestion. Something that could have been solved with a bottle of antacids from the kitchen cabinet. My mom didn't even look at me when she came in. She walked past me like I was part of the furniture, tossed her purse on the table, and asked if anyone had remembered to feed the dog. That dress hung in my closet for months with the tag still on. I never wore it again. That memory hit me like a freight train, and I realized it wasn't just about the wedding. It never had been. My entire life had been shaped around Neil's next symptom, real or not. And my parents, whether knowingly or through willful ignorance, had fed that dynamic like it was oxygen. So when Kay forwarded more of my mom's messages, recent ones, talking about how Neil might need emotional support in case the wedding post triggers something, I knew there was no coming back from this. They weren't sorry. They weren't waking up. They were still planning ways to take up space in my life. But what I didn't know yet was that someone else was waking up. Someone I never expected. Because a week later, Neil finally reached out. And what he had to say, it changed everything. It was a Thursday night when the email landed in my inbox. No subject line, just from Neil. I stared at it for a solid 10 minutes before I opened it, my finger hovering over the mouse like it might explode. I didn't know what I expected, maybe more blame, another layer of guilt shoved onto my back by the same brother who'd spent our entire childhood turning my milestones into his emergencies. But what I got instead was an apology. A real one. The email wasn't short. It read like someone had poured their guts out at 2 a.m. trying to hold a mirror up to everything they'd spent years pretending wasn't their fault. Neil admitted, in black and white, that he had manipulated our parents for attention since we were kids. That it started small, skipping school, avoiding chores, getting a little extra sympathy when he felt left out, but it turned into something darker. Something automatic. He wrote, "I didn't know how to stop. It became the only way I knew how to matter." He said he realized, especially over the last couple years, how deeply it had hurt me, but by then it was like the roles were set in concrete. Our parents never challenged him. They never asked questions. Every time he cried wolf, they dropped everything. And every time they did, I got left behind. Neil didn't hold back. He listed specific events. My piano recital. My 16th birthday. Graduation. Even the summer program I was accepted into and had to decline because he suddenly couldn't be left alone. He wrote, "I knew how important that was to you. I did it anyway. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. That you'd understand. I just didn't want to be forgotten. But I see now I made you invisible instead." Reading those words didn't bring me relief, it brought me rage. Not because he didn't mean them, but because they came years too late. He'd known. All this time he'd known. And he still let it happen. Again and again. But he didn't stop there. He said he started therapy 6 months ago. At first it was for anxiety and depression, but it quickly spiraled into something deeper. His therapist helped him recognize the family dynamic we'd been trapped in, how our parents, without even realizing it, had trained him to be sick and me to be invisible. That their love came with conditions, and those conditions were rooted in who could generate the most concern. Then came the part that made my jaw tighten. Neil had seen the texts between Kay and my mom, the ones planning to cause a distraction at the wedding. He admitted it made him physically sick. Said it was one thing to realize he'd done harm as a kid, but it was something else entirely to see our mother still orchestrating the same narrative well into adulthood. He wrote, "For the first time I understood what you've been dealing with. And it broke me." He told me our parents found out he was in therapy by accident, left his email open on the family computer during a visit. They read everything. His notes, his session summaries, even the message he was working on to send to me. And instead of supporting him, they threatened to cut him off. Cut him off. His apartment? Paid for by them. His car? Theirs. His job at a startup? Barely paying him anything. And now that he was stepping outside the script, they were yanking the rug out from under him. Neil said he wasn't going to play along anymore. He was looking for full-time work, planning to move into a cheaper place he could afford on his own. And he wanted to meet up. Said he understood if I didn't want anything to do with him, but hoped, just hoped, I might give him a chance to make amends. Face to face. No excuses. No distractions. I closed my laptop and just sat there, staring out the window. Jamie came over, read the email, and didn't say a word at first. He just placed a hand on my back and let the silence breathe. When he finally spoke, it was simple. You have every right to be angry. But you also have every right to choose if you want to let this crack open a new door. And I didn't know. Not yet. Because anger doesn't dissolve in a day. And apologies don't erase years of being overlooked, dismissed, or sacrificed for the comfort of someone else. But something about that email, maybe the detail, maybe the tone, felt like Neil meant it. Like, for the first time in his life, he wasn't acting. Still, good intentions don't undo damage. Especially not when the people who enabled it were still digging in their heels, doubling down, pretending none of it was real. Because even as Neil tried to move forward, my parents, they weren't done yet. They were just getting started. I wish I could say Neil's email gave me closure, that reading his confession settled the storm in my chest and helped me find peace with all of it. But the truth is, it cracked open something worse. Because while Neil was finally trying to take ownership, our parents were doubling down with everything they had. And when control slips through the hands of people who've always had it, they don't let go quietly. 2 days after Neil sent me that email, my dad left a voicemail, calm voice, tight-lipped tone, the kind of message where every word was laced with subtle venom. He said Neil had been manipulated by outside influences and was sick with guilt over what I had done to the family. He talked like I'd planted false memories in my brother's head, like I was pulling strings from the shadows instead of sitting here trying to piece together decades of emotional wreckage. Then came my mom's text, "I hope you're happy. Neil is completely falling apart now. We barely recognize him." No mention of the messages she sent planning to ruin my wedding. No acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, she had a hand in shaping the dysfunction she now blamed entirely on me. They didn't see Neil's awakening as a breakthrough. They saw it as betrayal. And suddenly, I realized what all those years had really been about. Neil wasn't the golden child because he was weak. He was the golden child because he was useful. Because every time he needed something, they could feel needed. They could feel like saviors. But now that Neil was growing a spine, their narrative started to collapse. And their desperation showed up everywhere. They sent a mass email to extended family, a carefully worded mess of half-truths, blaming me for isolating Neil and turning him against those who love him most. They painted me as a bitter, resentful daughter who couldn't stand to see her brother happy. There were no apologies. No accountability. Just spin. Always spin. Some relatives believed them. A few called me, urged me to be the bigger person. One even said, "Your parents are old. They're not going to be around forever. Do you really want to waste these years on grudges?" And I wanted to scream, this isn't a grudge. This is survival. You don't spend 20 years being dismissed, invalidated, overshadowed, and then just let it go because time's ticking. That's not healing. That's pretending. And I've done enough pretending to last me a lifetime. Jamie saw the toll it was taking. The way I stayed up late refreshing my email, wondering if Neil would write again. The way I hesitated every time my phone rang, just in case it was another relative looking to guilt-trip me. He started limiting who could contact me, set up filters, screened calls, even blocked a few numbers himself when I didn't have the strength to. Then came the day my mom showed up. No warning. No call. Just her standing at the front door of our apartment, arms crossed, eyes puffy from either crying or rehearsing a scene. I didn't let her in. I stepped outside, shut the door behind me, and stood there on the porch, arms folded, heart pounding. She said she just wanted to talk. I told her she had plenty of chances to talk at my graduation, at my thesis presentation, at the wedding. She was silent for a long time before finally saying, "You've always resented your brother." I laughed. Out loud. I couldn't help it. That was her takeaway? Not the abandonment. Not the stolen moments. Not the fact that she once let her son eat my birthday cake alone in a hospital while I sat at home with a frozen grocery store cupcake and a half-deflated balloon. No, to her, this was about resentment. I told her I didn't resent Neil. I resented the version of herself that could only show love through crisis. That the only time I ever saw her care deeply was when someone was falling apart. I told her that I could never compete, not because I wasn't worthy, but because I didn't bleed loudly enough. She said we did our best. And maybe they did. But sometimes your best isn't enough to undo the damage. I told her she needed to leave. She refused. Jamie stepped outside, calm as ever, stood beside me and said, "You need to go now." And for once, she listened. She walked away without another word. That night, I got another email from Neil. He said our parents were threatening to cut him off financially if he continued talking to me. Said they'd already started freezing his credit card, pulling back support on rent. But he was determined. He was applying for full-time jobs. He even sent me a few listings, asked me to look over his resume. It was surreal. The same brother who once faked chest pain to stop me from attending a science camp was now asking me for advice on job hunting. But I was cautious. I told him I'd meet him for coffee. Public place. Neutral ground. Because even with his apology, even with the honesty, I didn't know yet if he was still playing a role. I needed to see his eyes. Hear his voice. Watch his body language. I needed to know if the brother I used to see as the villain was finally ready to stand beside me instead of always stealing center stage. And so we set the date. I didn't know if I was walking into closure or another performance. But I was done living in the past. And maybe, just maybe, Neil was too. I got to the cafe 15 minutes early, not because I was eager, but because I needed to control something. I picked the booth by the window where I could see everyone walking in and ordered a black coffee I barely touched. My hands shook, not from nerves, but from everything I'd carried into that room, years of swallowed words, missed birthdays, and memories that never felt like mine. Then Neil walked in. And for the first time in my life, he looked small. Not physically, he was still taller than me, still had that lazy confidence in the way he moved, but there was something in his face that made him look like a kid again. Like the boy who used to crawl under the kitchen table during thunderstorms and whisper that the world sounded too big. He saw me, raised a hand in a sheepish wave, and sat down without saying a word for the first full minute. And I let him sit in it. Let him stew in the weight of the silence he'd earned. Finally, he looked up and said, "I know I don't deserve a second of your time." I nodded. Not out of agreement, but out of confirmation that, yeah, he was at least starting from the right place. He said he'd been working part-time at a startup his friend launched, but now he was applying to real jobs, jobs with structure and expectations and zero room for playing sick when things got tough. He said he hadn't told our parents about the meeting because they'd lose their minds. He said he hadn't spoken to them in 2 weeks since they threatened to cut off his car insurance and access to his apartment. And then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "I let them turn me into a weapon against you. And I don't even know who I am without that anymore." I didn't speak. I wanted him to keep going. And he did. He talked about growing up and realizing that being sick was the only time mom and dad showed up. Not just physically, but emotionally. That whenever he cried or clutched his chest or wheezed dramatically after soccer practice, he became the center of their world. Got out of schoolwork. Got extra snacks. Got love. It became currency. He told me that by the time he was 12, he didn't even know what symptoms were real and which ones he faked. I trained myself to believe it, he said. That way, I didn't have to feel guilty about it. He admitted that when I got my scholarship, the one for the summer science program, he overheard mom and dad talking about how proud they were of me. That he felt something break inside him. Not because he didn't want me to succeed, but because he didn't know how to cope with not being the center of the story. So he created a crisis. And just like that, they rallied around him. Again, he apologized for everything. Not in the hollow, obligatory way most people do, but in a slow, specific, brutally honest way. He even remembered the day of my homecoming, the way I stood at the top of the stairs in that blue dress, looking like I might cry but refusing to. He said that when mom and dad rushed him to the hospital and left me behind, he peeked out of the backseat window and saw me staring after the car. "I've never hated myself more than in that moment," he said. Still, I didn't say much. I wanted to feel something, relief maybe. Or forgiveness. But mostly I felt tired. Tired of carrying the emotional bill for a family that never paid theirs. When the waitress came back, he ordered a tea and offered to pay for both drinks. I let him. Not because I needed the gesture, but because I wanted him to start understanding that making amends comes in small choices, not grand speeches. He asked if I was open to rebuilding something, anything. I told him I wasn't sure yet. That honesty doesn't erase harm. That growth doesn't guarantee trust. That we could take slow, careful steps, but I wouldn't pretend nothing happened. He nodded. "I'll earn it," he said. "Even if it takes the rest of my life." We parted with a hug. Awkward. Hesitant. But real. As I walked back to my car, the weight didn't lift, but it shifted. Like maybe I didn't have to carry it all alone anymore. Like maybe after all the manipulation and lies, someone else finally decided to shoulder some of it. But as I started the engine, I glanced at my phone. One missed call. Mom. She had left a voicemail. And what she said in that message? It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea for peace. It was war. The voicemail was just under 2 minutes long, but it felt like a wrecking ball with no brakes. My mother's voice was calm, too calm, the way people sound when they're past anger but not past vengeance. She started with a quiet, "I hope you're happy," and ended with, "If you keep poisoning your brother against us, you'll be the reason this family dies." There it was. The mask fully off. Not a single mention of Neil's confession. Not a word about the texts she wrote planning to ruin my wedding. Nothing about the missed birthdays, forgotten graduations, or all the times I waited alone while Neil got carried off like some fragile prince on a stretcher of attention. Just blame. Always blame. And now it was all mine to carry again. I didn't listen to the message twice. I didn't need to. Her words had already fused into my bones the way years of manipulation tend to do. Jamie was in the kitchen making dinner when I played it out loud. He didn't say anything when it ended. Just looked at me and said, "So what now?" I knew exactly what now. I blocked her number. Then my dad's. Then set my phone so unknown numbers would go straight to voicemail. That night, I changed my email address, told the family members I trusted, left the rest in the dark. It wasn't about punishment. It was about peace. And if cutting the cord was the only way to find it, then so be it. I told Neil the next day. Sat across from him in a park near his new apartment. He'd just signed the lease, paid for by his own salary. He looked proud, a little nervous, but mostly determined. I told him I was done with our parents. That I wasn't waiting around for them to change. That I wasn't playing the family guilt game anymore. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He just nodded and said, "They're going to come after me next." I told him I knew. A week later, he called me in the middle of the day. He was rattled, said Mom had shown up at his work. Said she caused a scene in the lobby, accusing his co-workers of turning him against his real family. He ended up having to walk her out himself, and she cried the whole time, saying she didn't recognize him anymore. And he told me something I didn't expect. He said he didn't feel guilt. He felt grief. Not because he lost her, but because he realized he never really had her in the first place. That's what I'd been carrying all those years. Grief without closure. Love without safety. A family that looked normal on the outside but bled you dry the second you asked for a little space to breathe. Jamie and I moved to Boston not long after. He got an offer from a research institute and I landed a position at a biotech firm that felt like it had been tailor-made for me. New city. New apartment. New mornings without guilt or the constant threat of emotional ambush. Neil visited us 2 months after we moved in. He brought coffee, helped us hang a mirror in the hallway, and stayed for dinner. He asked about therapy. I gave him the name of my counselor. He said he wanted to go. He's not perfect. I'm not healed. But we're both trying. We don't talk about the past every time we meet, but we don't avoid it either. Sometimes we share little things. Like the time I came home with a 98 on a math test in 7th grade and no one said a word because Neil had a sinus infection. Or the time he faked a fall at church because I was going to sing a solo and he didn't want to sit through it. We talk about it like survivors do, softly, with just enough space between the words to make it breathable. The last time I spoke to my mother was through my lawyer. She sent a letter, handwritten, dramatic, full of spiritual quotes about forgiveness and the strength of family. She asked me to remember who raised you and said she hoped one day I'd come to my senses. I had the letter scanned and archived. I didn't respond. Because here's the truth, you can love someone from a distance. You can grieve someone who's still alive. And you can choose to break the chain, even if it means walking away from everything that used to define you. I didn't get the family I deserved. But I'm building the life I've always needed, with people who show up not when they're needed most, but when they're simply needed. No more stolen birthdays. No more invisible milestones. This chapter? It's mine. And this time, no one else gets to write it but me.